Well, thank you again for joining us in this next study in the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to please be turning to chapter 23 as we begin winding down a section in the book of Isaiah that we've been looking at for numerous lessons now. It began back in chapter 13. Chapters 13 through 23, as we began this session, we indicated was a series of burdens or oracles against nations. Some 10 nations were addressed. You got Babylon, Philistia, Moab, Syria, which Damascus was what was addressed, then Egypt and Edom and Arabia, Judah, and now Phoenicia or Tyre is going to be addressed. Very brief mention was also made of Ethiopia and Assyria. As you're looking at God's message of judgment against all these nations, the downfall of all of these nations. And it very well may be that one of the most important commercially was reserved here until last as we look at this study. Tyre was a major seaport. It was the chief city of Phoenicia. The Phoenicians, you might remember, were seagoing people. And the sea trade around that area, especially around the Mediterranean, was very key economically at that time. Tyre was located about 35 miles north of Mount Carmel. Now, I've used this illustration before, but if you will picture your thumb, and looking at your thumb, I'll get it right where you can see it. If you figure everything toward my side of the hand as the Mediterranean, you figure my hand as being the coastline, there's a little thumb that sticks out as you go up the coastline, and that is where Tyre was located. Mount Carmel was located. You go 35 miles farther north than that to get to the city of Tyre. The main part of the city was mainland, but also there was an island portion of the city, and this is going to be key as we move later into this lesson. There was an island portion of the city on which a fortress was built just offshore. And it was already an ancient city when the Israelites even arrived in Palestine. As we look at the history of Tyre, both David and Solomon had friendly dealings with Hiram, who was king of Tyre. We see that in 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 1, and also down into verse 18. The mountains of Lebanon were where they got the cedar for the cedar beams, the large portions of wood that were used in the temple that Solomon built. And likewise, when the people came back into the land as a remnant after the decree of Cyrus, when the temple was rebuilt, they had to go back to that area and get the larger timber again. And what basically would happen would be that the cedar was milled or produced. It was taken over to Tyre, where it was placed on a ship, and then it was ferried down to Joppa, just going down the coastline. Joppa is going to be pretty much due west of the Promised Land or Palestine, and then it would be ferried inland until you could get it to where you could use it. So it was a major approach, and Hiram, king of Tyre, was very influential and very useful in those times that kind of construction was built. 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 18 even indicates that his stonemasons were used at that time. So there was quite a history as you look at this area of Tyre. Well, unfortunately, the Phoenicians also had a negative impact on Israel. Solomon took foreign wives who influenced him to worship Ashtoreth. That's the goddess of the Sidonians. Sidon was the second largest city, some 25 miles farther north of Tyre. Ahab, an Israelite king, married Jezebel. She was the daughter of Ethbaal, also of Sidon. she introduced Baal worship into Israel. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 31-32. 1 Kings 18:4, 1 Kings 19, verses 1 and 2, 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 25. You're looking at, those would be good cross-references to see as it relates to the Baal worship that was then introduced. We might also remember that there on Mount Carmel, you find Elijah, God's prophet, who went into conflict with the prophets of Baal. And you look at the competition basically that took place over the wood that was stacked up as to determine who was the greater God. But when you look at the Sidonians, when you look at these Phoenicians, you see that a lot of the gods that plagued God's people right on down through to the demise of both Israel and Judah, a lot of this was introduced through this place called Tyre. Well, like Babylon in the east, Tyre in the west summed up all that the world thought to be significant. There was a lot of money, a lot of wealth, a lot of industry. All of these things made them to be an important place in the world. Basically, anything that went northwest, anything that went across the Mediterranean would largely be that which left from Tyre here. As you see, that major seaport that was involved. Well, as you might expect, just as with Babylon, when you find nations that find themselves being held in high esteem by others, that were revered by others, you would see them being filled with pride. And that's what happened here. Both Babylon and Tyre fell because of the same malady, the same disease. And it was their pride that puffed them up to see themselves of more than they really were. Numerous others, not only Elijah, not only Isaiah, spoke of the fall of Tyre. You might jot down Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 4, Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 4, and in the minor prophets, Zechariah chapter 9, verses 3 and 4. So you're looking at several biblical writers dealt with the concept of the fall of Tyre. It was a major event. For Tyre to go down would not only be something that God's people needed to see regarding the punishment of the nations, but it would also impact the world in a major way as it related to the economy there. So let's go ahead and move through chapter 23 now. And let's look at verses 1 through 7 and look at the lament over Tyre's downfall. The burden against Tyre. Wail, ye ships of Tarshish, for it is laid waste, so that there is no house, no harbor. From the land of Cyprus it is revealed to them. Be still, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon, whom those who cross the sea have filled. And on great waters, the grain of Shihor, the harvest of the river, is her revenue, and she is a marketplace for the nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea has spoken, the strength of the sea, saying, I do not labor nor bring forth children, neither do I rear young men, nor bring up virgins. When the report reaches Egypt, they also will be in agony at the report of Tyre. Cross over to Tarshish. Wail, you inhabitants of the coastland. Is this your joyous city, whose antiquity is from ancient days, whose feet carried her far off to dwell? So what you're looking at is a symbolic weeping over the fall of Tyre. When you look at the ships of Tarshish, they were the largest trading vessels in antiquity. When I think about Tarshish, I can't help but think about Jonah. Jonah, a zealously patriotic Jew, was commissioned by God to go to Nineveh and to preach repentance. Rather than do that, however, he chose to attempt to go to Tarshish, major trade routes. He was on a ship. All of those sailors, even though they were so afraid of that storm, they had weathered storms before. And you're looking at a seafaring people that prided themselves and the capabilities they had and what they perceived to be their importance on the remainder of the world because of that seaport, that hub that was so key. Anything inward, if you get over to the eastern side of the Mediterranean, anything eastward there was dependent upon them to get or to sell their product, getting it to market. They were capable of the longest voyages. We're talking about those ships of Tarshish. Tarshish was the most remote seaport at that time. But the lament that is expressed here has to do with the fall of Tyre. Now, our difficulty here is trying to pinpoint exactly when that happened. What specifically, what point in time was God talking about when this was going to occur? The city came under attack several times from the 7th century BC onward. Alexander the Great was the one who brought down its eventual complete destruction. And that was in 332 BC when he began his conquest of the world, when he became the world power again. Remember, it was Alexander the Great that replaced the Medo-Persians as the world power. As it relates to rank, we're looking at Assyria, then Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece that was seen. And here again, we've got to go back into our history books to find out, other than by prophecy, the involvement of Alexander in this. Now, part of the demise there was seen in other passages that dealt with it. Now, we're not going to take the time to do that because I want to stay with Isaiah's burden as much as possible here. But for us to understand the complete fall, remember that there was a mainland city and then there was an island city that was a fortress. And whenever difficulty came, they would go out to that island city, hole up in that fortress, and saw themselves all but impregnable there. However, when Alexander, history tells us, took down the mainland city, all of the rubble that was there, he basically scraped that clean and he built a land bridge out, and Tyre fell completely. When you look at other prophecies, I believe Ezekiel prophesied of this. Basically, Tyre was only going to be a place of the spreading of nets. It's going to lose forever the impact that it once held, the power that it once held, the impact that it once had on so many others. God brought them down. Well, now we're seeing a sadness, a dirge, a funeral dirge, if you will, for this great city that is going to fall. When you look at verses 2 through 6, again, we're looking at the symbolic language portrayed there, but Tyre's fall would have devastating effects throughout the Mediterranean because, again, it was such a hub, such an important place. Egypt exported vast quantities of grain that were shipped on these Phoenician vessels. Many cities in Isaiah's day depended on that grain that came from Egypt at that time. And so being that hub, they were an important place and it filled them with pride, the station that they had attained in life. Then when you look at verse 7, her fall sent shock waves throughout the world because she had stood for centuries. Remember, we had indicated that when the people came into Palestine under the leadership of Joshua, Tyre had already been there for some time. You're looking at an ancient city, years and years, centuries upon centuries of history. And now they're going to be gone. They're going to be wiped out. Tyre had helped colonize numerous other ancient places. They had long been around, but now the demise is spoken of. So what was going to happen? What was going to bring this about? Imagine Isaiah telling this account to people. Many of these passages may have started orally as a tradition. But imagine just the scenario, the possibility of Isaiah giving an oral depiction of this. And I can picture somebody in the crowd raising their hand and saying, how's this going to happen? How can it happen? Tyre is too great. Tyre is too important. And Isaiah's answer would be seen in this next response, verses 8 through 12. It's going to fall as a judgment from God. Who has taken this counsel against Tyre, the crowning city, whose merchants are princes, whose traders are the honorable of the earth? The Lord of hosts has purposed it, to bring to dishonor the pride of all glory, to bring into contempt all the honorable of the earth. Overflow through your land like the river, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no more strength. He stretched out his hand over the sea. He shook the kingdoms. The Lord has given a commandment against Canaan to destroy its strongholds. And he said, you will rejoice no more, O you oppressed virgin daughter of Zion. Arise, cross over to Cyprus. There also you will have no rest. Now, when you think about Cyprus, think about that coastline there of Palestine and the Mediterranean. And then go out into the Mediterranean just a little bit and you'll find the island of Cyprus. Another important place as we look at those things. But everybody knew about Cyprus as well in that area. When you look at verse 8, the nations would ask why this happened. Now, I depicted it as Isaiah talking to a crowd. But here Isaiah, in figurative language, is indicating the nations around about, the nations who are hearing about this fall. The nations are personified, asking, how's this going to happen? Why had this happened? And who planned it? And the exclamation point is driven home. The mighty city had fallen. When you look at verse 9, Isaiah there immediately identified God as the ultimate source of Tyre's fall. No matter how powerful the nation is, no matter how deeply entrenched in their idolatry they had become, no matter how much they had rejected God and his will, you're looking at God being shown to be sovereign here. All nations are going to acknowledge who he is. Remember Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, we see Jesus emptying himself of equality with God and taking the form of man. When you look at him ascending back to the Father, as you get down to the bottom of that context, it says, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. That's true, just as true today, and it was true in Tyre's day. They may have rejected God. They may have denied God. They may have had their own idols and worshiped their own idols. They had built up pride, but they still had to answer to God for that pride. And it's for that pride that God brought them down. But then in verses 10 through 12, Isaiah indicates that Tyre is not the only one who's going to suffer from this. The destruction is not going to be limited to Phoenicia. Tarshish and Canaan would also be affected. But the whole point being made there is that there would be no rest in that day. Go ahead and try to flee to Cyrus. You're not going to be able to get away. Arise, verse 12, cross over to Cyprus. There also you will have no rest. Once God has determined judgment against a nation, it's going to be in his time. But also there's going to be no relief, and there's going to be no avoiding it. Brethren, we are headed toward a judgment day ourselves. God has promised to save the faithful, those who come to him on his terms and remain in that faithful state. Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. But also the vast majority is going to be lost. And no matter how much they deny God, no matter how much they refuse to believe, they're still headed for that judgment. And whatever judgment is handed down is going to be severe. It's going to be based on God's holiness and his justice. And it's going to happen. And nothing's going to keep it from happening. That's the lesson that the nations are taught regarding Tyre. Oh, that other people would learn their lessons. Would that not have changed how people round about them acted? All these times that we see these nations going down, this entire section of chapter 13 through 23, bearing all of that out. Oh, if people had only listened to God. And sadly, if only God's people had listened. But that simply was not the case, as all 12 tribes were eventually punished, facing God's divine judgment because of their rejection of his will. They also learned that once God hands down judgment, once God determines that he's going to punish these people, nothing shy of repentance is going to turn it around. Well, then there's going to be restoration that follows this destruction. Let's look at the rest of this chapter. Behold the land of the Chaldeans, this people which was not. Assyria founded it for wild beasts of the desert. They set up its towers, they raised up its palaces, and brought it to ruin. Wail, you ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. Now it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre will be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. At the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot. Take a harp, go about the city, you forgotten harlot. Make sweet melodies, sing many songs, that you may be remembered. And it shall be at the end of 70 years that the Lord will deal with Tyre. She will return to her hire and commit fornication with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Her gain and her pay will be set apart for the Lord. It will not be treasured nor laid up, for her gain will be for those who dwell before the Lord, to eat sufficiently and for fine clothing. Now, the destruction would be seen from Chaldea in the east to Tarshish, which is in the remote west. Tyre would be a city that would be asking to be remembered like a forgotten harlot. Such a woman might walk about playing a harp or a lyre and singing many songs, calling attention to herself because people had forgotten her. When you look at this 70 years, that seems to simply be referring to a complete period of time. There are those who believe that it's talking about the time of Babylonian rule when this was seen. Basically 606 to 539, that 70 years is not a literal period of time, but it's a member speaking of completeness. The number 7 being the number for completeness. The number 10, you're raising it to a higher power, emphasizing even more the strength of that completion, the power of that completion. Now, commentators vary on their understanding of this last section, and Homer Haley in his commentary on Isaiah may have provided the best understanding here, and I want to quote him. Inasmuch as Jehovah judges and brings to an end, also restores and builds up, might not the prophecy mean simply that whatever the motive of tradesmen, Jehovah uses commerce for the good of mankind, consecrating it for that purpose? What we know of God and his way tends to make this view the most reasonable. God is going to bring to an end. God is going to build up. It's at his discretion. It's in his power to do these things. God had used the commerce of Tyre for the benefit of others. But that doesn't mean that Tyre is not going to have to change or to face the judgment. Chapters 13 through 23 speaks of the demise, the judgment against these nations, the burden. It's a difficult section of the book. It's hard for us to see. But now in our next lesson, we're going to branch out. And rather than looking at specific individual nations regarding judgment, the next section includes chapters 24 through 27 of Isaiah, and it's God's judgment of all the earth. In verse 24, Isaiah is going to speak first of all of God's judgment on the whole earth. Because of his righteousness, because of his judgment, or because of his righteousness, his judgment was inevitable. However, in a song of praise to God, Isaiah spoke of this judgment as justice for the wicked and deliverance for the faithful, chapter 25. So one chapter deals with judgment, another chapter shows the basis of that judgment and the reality that's been in existence for so long, blessing and cursing, depending upon how one approaches God. In a song of rejoicing there in chapter 25, we're going to see an example of comfort in difficult times for those who trusted in God during times of trouble. And then there in chapter 26, he used symbolism and imagery to depict the punishment of evil, and concluded with the idea of his people once again worshiping him in the holy mountain, chapter 27. So there's just a taste of what we're going to be looking at over the next several lessons. I want to thank you again for joining us in this study. I'm hoping that you're benefiting from the emphasis being placed on history, the powerful lessons that are shown, and the kind of language that is used, and learning our own lessons from these things. Seeing the negative for what it is, judgment that is due because of rejection of God, but also a message of hope throughout. As we move through Isaiah, we're going to see so many powerful messages of hope, and we grow from them. Until next time, God bless you.